The dust cloud rose like a prayer to heaven, but what approached was nothing holy. 3 cavalry horses thundered toward the canyon's edge. Their riders bent low, whips cracking against foam-flecked flanks. Behind them the prison wagon bounced violently over the rocky terrain, its iron-barred windows revealing glimpses of desperate faces within, and blocking their path. Standing alone in the middle of the narrow canyon trail was a man who should have been dead. Thomas Black Tom Harrington raised his hands slowly, palms open to show he carried no weapon. The sun carved deep shadows across his weathered face, and his voice carried across the desert wind with startling clarity. "I have nothing left to lose except her." The lead rider's horse reared as he yanked the reins, sending a cascade of pebbles tumbling into the chasm below. Captain Samuel Morrison's hand moved instinctively to his Colt .45, but something in the outlaw's stance made him pause. This was no ambush, this was something else entirely. 6 months earlier, the saloon doors of Deadwood Creek swung open with their familiar groan, admitting a figure that made conversation falter throughout the smoke-filled room. Elena Morningstar moved with the fluid grace of her Apache mother and the determined stride of her Irish father, though she belonged fully to neither world. Her long black hair was braided with silver ribbons that caught the lamplight, and her dress, a curious blend of calico cotton and beaded deerskin, marked her as one who walked between two peoples. She carried her guitar case close to her chest like armor, knowing that in a town where the only entertainment came from whiskey, cards, and the occasional traveling preacher, a half-blood girl with a voice like honey over gravel was both blessing and curse. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd lost his left arm to a grizzly bear, nodded toward the small wooden stage in the corner. "You're on after the card game ends, girl. Same rules as always. No touching the customers, no drinking their liquor, and no staying past midnight." Elena nodded, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Each night brought the same mixture of appreciation and disdain from the audience. Men who would listen to her sing ballads of lost love and distant homes while simultaneously whispering about her mixed blood when they thought she couldn't hear. As she tuned her guitar, the saloon doors burst open again. This time the entire room fell silent. Thomas Harrington stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. He was a man carved from the very rock of the mountains, tall, solid, with hands that had known both honest work and desperate violence. His reputation preceded him like the shadow of a storm cloud: cattle rustler, train robber, and according to some, cold-blooded killer. But as his eyes found Elena's across the crowded room, something in his hard expression softened like ice touched by spring sun. He walked to the bar, spurs jingling softly, and ordered whiskey without taking his gaze from her. When she began to sing, a mournful ballad about a warrior who loved a woman from an enemy tribe, his knuckles went white around his glass. Her voice rose and fell like wind through canyon walls, carrying within it all the loneliness of the frontier, all the ache of belonging neither here nor there. And when the song ended, Thomas Harrington did something that shocked everyone in the saloon, including Elena herself. He stood up and applauded, not the rough, appreciative clapping of men who saw her as entertainment, but the respectful acknowledgement of one artist recognizing another's gift. In that moment something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words, a recognition of kindred spirits lost in a harsh world. After her set, he approached the stage. Up close, she could see that his eyes were the color of sage in morning light, and despite his fearsome reputation, he spoke to her with unexpected gentleness. "That song," he said, his voice rough from years of shouting over cattle drives and gunfights. "You wrote it yourself?" Elena nodded, surprised by the question. Most men asked about her bloodline first, then whether she was available for more private entertainment. "My grandmother taught me the melody," she said. "It's about two people from different worlds who find each other despite everything trying to keep them apart." Thomas smiled then, and she realized it transformed his entire face. The hardness fell away, revealing something vulnerable and achingly human beneath. "I'd like to hear it again sometime," he said, "if that's all right with you." And so began the most unlikely courtship in the history of Deadwood Creek. Over the following weeks, Thomas became a regular at the saloon, but not in the way other men were regulars. He never drank to excess, never started fights, never leered at the dancing girls who worked the later shift. He came to listen to Elena sing, and afterward they would talk. They talked about everything and nothing. Her childhood caught between two cultures, his youth on a failing ranch that led to his first desperate robbery. She told him about her dreams of traveling to San Francisco to sing in real theaters, and he spoke of his fantasy of owning a small spread of land where he could raise horses and live honestly. "Why did you become an outlaw?" she asked one night, as they sat on the saloon's back porch. The desert stars spread above them like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "My pa owned a small ranch outside Tucson. When I was 19, a banker named Cornelius Wade foreclosed on us, illegally though we couldn't prove it. Pa died of a broken heart that winter, and Ma followed him by spring. I had two choices, starve or fight. I chose to fight." He paused, staring out at the moonlit landscape. "First time I robbed Wade's bank, I told myself it was justice. Second time, it was revenge. By the third time," he shrugged. "By then I was just Thomas Harrington the outlaw, and that was all I knew how to be." Elena reached out and touched his hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact. His skin was rough from work and weather, scarred from fights and rope burns, but his fingers trembled slightly at her touch. "That's not all you are," she said softly. "I see who you really are when you listen to music. I see the man you were meant to be." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, filled with wonder at finding such tenderness in such a hard world. Under the vast canopy of stars, with the desert wind carrying the scent of sage and possibility, Elena Morningstar and Thomas Harrington fell hopelessly, completely in love. For 6 perfect weeks, they existed in a bubble of stolen moments. Thomas would arrive each evening just as Elena took the stage, and she would sing as if she were singing only for him. He told her stories of his travels, painting pictures of cities beyond the mountains and oceans beyond the desert. She taught him Apache words and sang him lullabies her grandmother had hummed while braiding her hair. They made plans and whispered conversations. He would turn himself in, serve his time, and when he was released, they would head west together. She would sing in San Francisco's grandest theaters while he managed the finest stables in California. It was a beautiful dream, fragile as spun glass. The dream shattered on a Tuesday night in September. The reckoning. Elena was midway through her second set when the saloon doors exploded inward. Federal Marshal Jake Brennan strode in flanked by 4 deputies, their badges gleaming in the lamplight like accusations. The music died in Elena's throat as every eye in the room turned to the corner table where Thomas sat nursing his usual single whiskey. "Thomas Harrington." Brennan's voice cut through the sudden silence like a blade. "You're under arrest for the murder of federal judge William Hayes." The blood drained from Elena's face as she watched the man she loved slowly stand, his hands rising without being asked. This was wrong. Thomas had been with her the night Judge Hayes was killed. She'd read about it in the territorial newspaper. A robbery gone wrong in El Paso 3 months ago. "I didn't kill Judge Hayes," Thomas said quietly, his eyes finding Elena's across the room. In them she saw not guilt but a deep, weary resignation. "Maybe not," Marshal Brennan replied, snapping iron shackles around Thomas's wrists. "But you were there, and that makes you just as guilty in the eyes of the law." As they dragged him away, Thomas called over his shoulder, "Elena, remember what I told you about San Francisco. Don't let this place keep you small." The saloon door swung shut behind them, and Elena collapsed onto the stage, her guitar clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the sudden quiet like a heart breaking. The trial. The trial was held in Prescott 3 weeks later. Elena made the journey alone, using every penny of her savings to pay for stage passage and a room at a modest boarding house. She had to testify. She was Thomas's alibi for the night in question. But more than that, she had to be there for him. The courthouse was packed with curiosity seekers and journalists from as far away as Denver. The Harrington case had captured the public imagination, a notorious outlaw finally brought to justice for his most heinous crime. Elena's testimony was clear and unshakable. On the night Judge Hayes was murdered in El Paso, Thomas Harrington had been in Deadwood Creek, listening to her sing and talking with her on the saloon's back porch, until well past midnight. Half a dozen other witnesses corroborated seeing him there, but the prosecution had a compelling counter-narrative. Yes, Thomas Harrington might not have pulled the trigger, but he had planned the robbery with his gang. When Judge Hayes recognized one of the robbers during the heist, the judge had to die to protect their identities. Under territorial law, all participants in a crime resulting in murder were equally guilty. Thomas's defense attorney, a young man fresh from law school who'd been assigned the case, did his best, but the evidence was damning. Letters found in the gang's hideout detailed the planned robbery, written in Thomas's distinctive handwriting. 3 surviving gang members testified that he'd been the ringleader, though Elena noticed they'd all received reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. When Thomas took the stand in his own defense, he spoke with quiet dignity about his relationship with Elena, about his desire to change his life and start over. But when pressed about his involvement in planning the robbery, he fell silent. "I won't deny I've done wrong," he said finally. "I've stolen from banks and trains, and I've hurt people in the process. But I didn't plan Judge Hayes' murder, and I didn't know it was going to happen." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty of first-degree murder. Sentence, death by hanging. Elena was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She watched Thomas's shoulders slump slightly, the only sign of emotion he allowed himself, and when the judge asked if he had any final words, he turned to look directly at her. "I regret many things I've done in my life," he said, "but I'll never regret loving Elena Morningstar. She showed me who I could have been, and that's worth dying for." The gavel fell like thunder. The last ride. 2 weeks later, Elena stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside the territorial prison in Yuma, her traveling bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. She'd received an unexpected visitor the previous evening, Captain Samuel Morrison of the 7th Cavalry. "Miss Morningstar," he'd said, hat in hand. "I have an unusual proposition for you." Morrison explained that his men were escorting Thomas and 3 other condemned prisoners to the new federal penitentiary in Colorado, where they would await their executions. It was a 5-day journey through some of the most dangerous territory in the Southwest, Apache country, where his half-Apache heritage might prove useful. "My men haven't had proper entertainment in months," Morrison said. "The territorial government has authorized me to hire a musician to accompany the convoy, to keep morale up during the journey. The pay is $50, enough to get you to San Francisco with money to spare." Elena stared at him. "You want me to sing for your soldiers while you transport the man I love to his death?" Morrison had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I know it's not ideal, miss, but it would give you a chance to say goodbye properly. And frankly, Harrington's been asking for you every day since the trial ended." Now, as the prison wagon rolled into view in the gray morning light, Elena wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The wagon was essentially an iron cage on wheels, with small barred windows and a single door secured with 3 separate locks. Through those bars she could see Thomas sitting with his back against the wall, his wrists shackled to a chain around his waist. Their eyes met as the wagon passed, and she saw him mouth her name, her heart clenched like a fist. Captain Morrison helped her up onto the supply wagon that would serve as her stage for the evening performances. "We'll make camp at Devil's Canyon tonight," he told her. "It's the only water source for 50 miles in any direction." As the small caravan rolled out into the desert, 3 cavalry outriders, the prison wagon, Elena's supply wagon, and Morrison bringing up the rear, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was riding toward something larger than a simple prisoner transport. The canyon. Devil's Canyon was a slash in the earth that seemed carved by the finger of an angry god. Red sandstone walls rose on either side of a narrow passage that widened into a small valley with a spring-fed pool of clear water. It was beautiful and terrible, like something from a fever dream. They made camp as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Elena helped the cook prepare the evening meal, while the soldiers tended their horses and checked their weapons. Thomas and the other prisoners were allowed out of the wagon to eat, though they remained shackled and under heavy guard. Elena's first performance was scheduled for after dinner, but she found reasons to stay near the prison wagon, stealing glances at Thomas whenever she thought the guards weren't looking. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face gaunt from weeks of poor prison food and sleepless nights. But when he caught her looking, he smiled with such tenderness that her breath caught in her throat. During dinner, she managed to sit close enough to hear him talking quietly with Private Jackson, one of the younger guards. "You ever been in love, son?" Thomas asked. Jackson, barely 18 and obviously homesick, nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. Got a girl back in Missouri. Planning to marry her when my enlistment's up." "Then you understand," Thomas said, glancing toward Elena. "Love makes everything else seem small, doesn't it? All the things you thought mattered, pride, revenge, even your own life, they just fade away compared to wanting to make one person happy." Jackson followed his gaze to Elena and nodded slowly. "Must be hard, knowing you'll never see her again." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "The hard part isn't dying, Private. The hard part is knowing she'll blame herself, that she'll think if she'd loved me differently, or more, or better, somehow things would have turned out different." Elena's throat tightened, and she had to turn away before her tears gave her away. When it came time for her performance, she set up her small stage near the campfire, with the soldiers gathered around on logs and bedrolls. The prisoners sat slightly apart, their guards alert but relaxed in the peaceful evening air. She began with the song Thomas had first heard her sing, the ballad about the warrior and the woman from enemy tribes. But tonight, the words carried new weight, new sorrow. As her voice rose and fell with the ancient melody, she saw several of the soldiers wipe their eyes, moved by emotions they couldn't name. When the song ended, Captain Morrison called out, "Do you know any happier songs, miss? Something to lift our spirits?" Elena looked across the fire at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. She launched into a rollicking frontier ballad about a cowboy and his horse, complete with sound effects that had the soldiers laughing and clapping along. For a moment, the approaching executions and the harsh reality of their mission faded away, replaced by simple human connection around a campfire under the stars. As the evening wound down and the soldiers began preparing for sleep, Elena packed away her guitar with hands that trembled slightly. Tomorrow they would reach the Colorado border, and the day after that the federal prison. Soon, very soon, this strange journey would end. She was heading toward her bedroll when a voice stopped her. "Elena." She turned to find Thomas standing at the edge of the firelight, his guard having stepped away for a moment to relieve himself behind the rocks. The chain connecting his ankle shackles gave him just enough mobility to take a few steps toward her. Without thinking, she moved to meet him, and suddenly, they were close enough to touch, close enough to breathe the same air. "I need you to know something," he said urgently, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I told that boy about lovemaking, everything else seems small. That's true, but it's not the whole truth." Elena waited, afraid to speak lest she break the spell of this stolen moment. Love doesn't just make other things seem small, Thomas continued. It makes you bigger. Bigger than your mistakes. Bigger than your fears. Bigger than what other people think you are. You made me bigger than I'd ever been, Elena. You made me see that I could be more than just Thomas Harrington the outlaw. You are more, she whispered. You've always been more. He shook his head. Not always, but I am now, because of you. And I need you to remember that when, he swallowed hard, when this is over, I need you to remember that love isn't about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go so the person you love can become who they were meant to be. Private Jackson was returning from the rocks, and their time was up. But as Thomas stepped back into the shadows, he said one more thing that would echo in Elena's mind for the rest of her life. Go to San Francisco, Elena. Sing in those theaters. And when you do, remember that somewhere in whatever comes after this life, I'll be listening. The escape. Elena was awakened before dawn by urgent whispers and the sound of running feet. She sat up in her bedroll, immediately alert, and saw Captain Morrison crouched over Private Jackson, who was lying motionless by the dying campfire. What happened? She asked, though a cold dread was already spreading through her chest. Prisoners are gone, Morrison said grimly. All 4 of them. Jackson's alive, but barely. Looks like they got hold of his keys somehow. Elena's heart hammered as she looked toward the empty prison wagon, its door hanging open like a wound in the darkness. How long ago? Can't be more than an hour. We'll track them come daylight. But Morrison shook his head. This is Apache country, Miss Morningstar. If they know where they're going, they could disappear into these canyons and never be found. As the sun rose over the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elena helped tend to Private Jackson while the soldiers prepared for pursuit. The young man had a severe head wound, but was conscious enough to tell them what had happened. It was the big one, he whispered, referring to Thomas. He asked me to loosen his chains so he could sleep more comfortable. When I bent down to check the lock, something hit me from behind. But Miss Morningstar, Elena leaned closer. What is it, Private? Before I passed out, I heard him talking to the others. He said something strange. He said, "You 3 head for Mexico. I've got something else I need to do first." Elena's blood turned to ice. She knew, with sudden terrible certainty, exactly what Thomas needed to do. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "We need to move the wagon. Now." Morrison looked at her strangely. "Why?" "The trail leads east toward the Colorado border. They're trying to get as far away as possible." "No," Elena said, rising to her feet with new determination. "Thomas isn't running away. He's coming back." The confrontation. They were halfway through the narrow passage leading out of Devil's Canyon when Elena's prediction proved horrifyingly accurate. The lead rider's horse suddenly reared, and there, standing alone in the middle of the trail with the morning sun at his back, was Thomas Harrington. He was no longer shackled, though Elena could see the raw marks on his wrists where the iron had chafed. His clothes were torn from climbing the canyon walls, and there was dried blood on his forehead from a cut above his left eye. But he stood straight and steady, his hands open at his sides, facing down 3 armed cavalry soldiers and their officer. "I have nothing left to lose," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air, "except her." Captain Morrison's horse danced nervously as he kept his gun trained on the escaped prisoner. "Stand aside, Harrington. You're only making this worse for yourself." Thomas smiled, and Elena saw in that expression the same fearless acceptance she'd witnessed when the jury read his death sentence. "Can't get much worse than hanging, Captain, but it can get better." "What do you want?" Morrison demanded. "I want to make a trade," Thomas said simply. "Me for her." Elena's breath caught in her throat as she understood what he was proposing. From her position on the supply wagon, she could see the deadly tableau spread out before her. Morrison and his 3 soldiers with their weapons drawn, Thomas standing unarmed but unafraid in the narrow canyon pass, and the sheer walls rising on either side, making escape impossible for anyone. "She's not a prisoner," Morrison said. "She's free to go any time she wants." Thomas shook his head. "No, she's not. She's a prisoner of her love for me, just like I'm a prisoner of my love for her. As long as I'm alive, she'll keep hoping, keep waiting, keep living in the shadow of my mistakes. I won't let her waste her life on a dead man." Elena started to climb down from the wagon, but Sergeant Walsh caught her arm. "Stay put, miss. This is getting dangerous." "Let me talk to him," she pleaded. "I can make him surrender." "I don't think he's planning to surrender," Morrison said grimly. And indeed, Thomas was walking forward now, step by measured step, never taking his eyes off Elena. "I want her to go to San Francisco," he called out. "I want her to sing in those theaters and fall in love with someone who can give her the life she deserves. And I want to know that she's free to do it." "Thomas, stop," Elena cried, finally breaking free from Walsh's grip and jumping down from the wagon. "Don't do this." He paused, and for a moment his resolve seemed to waver. "I love you too much to let you love me, Elena. Do you understand?" Morrison's voice was tight with tension. "Last warning, Harrington. Stand down or I'll shoot." Thomas looked at the captain, then back at Elena, and his smile became something transcendent, filled with a peace she'd never seen in him before. "Captain, I've been dead since the day they sentenced me. This isn't dying, this is finally living." And then he did something that no one expected. He started to sing. It was Elena's song, the ballad about the warrior and the woman from enemy tribes, but in his rough, untrained voice, it became something entirely new. A hymn of sacrifice, a lament for love that transcends death, a battle cry for the courage to let go. As his voice echoed off the canyon walls, Thomas continued walking forward, his hands still open, his stride steady and sure. Morrison's finger tightened on his trigger, but something in the moment, the haunting melody, the morning light painting everything golden, the sight of a man walking toward death with such grace, made him hesitate. Elena was running now, desperate to reach Thomas before the inevitable happened, but Sergeant Walsh and 2 of the soldiers caught her, holding her back as she struggled and cried his name. Thomas reached the end of his song just as he reached Morrison's horse. The captain's gun was pressed against his chest, but Thomas looked past him to Elena, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Remember me singing," he said softly. "Not dying, singing." Morrison's finger began to squeeze the trigger, the twist. The gunshot echoed through Devil's Canyon like thunder, and Elena screamed as she saw Thomas stagger backward. But as the smoke cleared, she realized something impossible had happened. Thomas was still standing. Captain Morrison sat slumped in his saddle, a spreading crimson stain across his uniform shirt, his gun falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the rocks below. From the canyon rim above, a figure appeared with a smoking rifle. Private Jackson, pale and swaying from his head wound, but alive and determined. "I'm sorry, Captain," Jackson called down, his young voice cracking with emotion, "but that man's right about love, and I couldn't let you kill him for it." The other soldiers whirled in confusion, unsure who to aim at now. In that moment of chaos, Thomas reached up and pulled Morrison from his horse, catching the wounded officer before he could fall. "He needs medical attention," Thomas said calmly, applying pressure to the captain's shoulder wound. "The bullet went clean through. He'll live if we stop the bleeding." Elena broke free from her captors and ran to Thomas, throwing her arms around him even as he knelt beside the man who'd been about to kill him. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered against his neck. "You can't lose me," he murmured back. "Not anymore." Sergeant Walsh lowered his weapon, looking from his wounded captain to the escaped prisoner who was now trying to save the man's life. "I don't understand what's happening here." Thomas looked up at him, his hands red with Morrison's blood, but his eyes clear and calm. "What's happening, Sergeant, is that sometimes you have to choose between the law and what's right. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they turn out to be the same thing." Private Jackson had climbed down from the rim and stood swaying on his feet, his rifle hanging loose in his grip. "There's something you all need to know," he said, "about Judge Hayes's murder." Elena felt Thomas go very still beside her. "Before I passed out last night," Jackson continued, "I heard the other 3 prisoners talking. They were laughing about how they'd pinned the murder on Harrington when it was really the one called Snake who pulled the trigger. They said the judge recognized Snake from a previous robbery, and Snake killed him to keep from being identified." The silence that followed was broken only by Morrison's labored breathing and the whisper of wind through the canyon. "They said they testified against Harrington because the federal prosecutor promised them life sentences instead of hanging," Jackson went on. "They figured better him than them since he was already wanted for so many other crimes." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, and Elena saw a lifetime of pain and acceptance wash over his features. "Why are you telling us this, son?" Jackson straightened, despite his obvious pain. "Because watching you and Miss Elena, seeing how you love each other, it reminded me what I'm fighting for, what we're all supposed to be fighting for. Truth, justice, the right for good people to find happiness." Sergeant Walsh cleared his throat. "Private Jackson, are you prepared to swear to this testimony in a court of law?" "Yes, sir. And I think if we catch those other 3, they might be willing to tell the truth now that they know their deal with the prosecutor won't hold up anyway." Thomas helped Morrison sit up against a rock, the captain's breathing steadier now that the bleeding had slowed. Morrison looked up at the man who'd just saved his life, confusion and something like respect warring in his eyes. "Why?" Morrison asked weakly. Thomas glanced at Elena, then back at the wounded officer. "Because you were just doing your job, Captain, and because Elena taught me that love isn't about revenge, it's about making the world a little better than you found it." The resolution. 6 months later, Elena stood on the stage of the Golden Gate Theater in San Francisco, looking out at an audience of 800 people who had come to hear the woman the newspapers were calling the Songbird of the West. Her dress was silk now instead of calico, and her guitar had been replaced by a full orchestra. But when she opened her mouth to sing, it was still the same voice that had enchanted a rough saloon in Deadwood Creek. In the 3rd row, center section, sat a man whose weathered hands applauded with the enthusiasm of someone who had never taken music for granted. Thomas Harrington, officially exonerated of Judge Hayes's murder, and pardoned for his previous crimes in recognition of his cooperation in capturing the real killers, wore a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit his rancher's frame, but his smile could have lit up the whole theater. After the show, as Elena signed programs and accepted flowers from admirers, she kept glancing toward the stage door where Thomas waited patiently. They had learned, during the long legal process that cleared his name, that love didn't require grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. Sometimes it was simply the choice to stand beside someone, day after day, as they became who they were meant to be. When the last admirer had gone, and the theater was empty except for the cleaning crew, Elena finally made her way to where Thomas stood. "So," she said, slipping her hand into his, "what did you think of your first opera house performance?" Thomas pulled her close, his eyes bright with pride and wonder. "I think," he said, "that we've got a lot more songs to write together." They walked out into the San Francisco night, where gas lamps lit the streets like fallen stars and the air smelled of salt and possibility. Above them, the same constellations that had watched over their first kiss in Deadwood Creek now blessed their new beginning. Elena had achieved her dream of singing in grand theaters, but she had learned something more valuable than fame or fortune. She had learned that love, real love, doesn't demand that you choose between your dreams and the person who matters most. Real love helps you build dreams big enough for two, and Thomas had discovered that redemption wasn't something you earned through suffering or sacrifice. It was something you chose, every day, by deciding to be better than you were the day before. 3 years later, when their first child was born in the little house they'd built overlooking the bay, they named her Hope, because hope, they had learned, was love's greatest gift. The ability to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, that broken things could be mended, and that two people from different worlds could create something beautiful together. On quiet evenings, when Hope was asleep and the fog rolled in from the Pacific, Elena would take out her old guitar and sing the ballad that had brought them together, the song about the warrior and the woman from enemy tribes. But now it had a new verse, one they had written together, about love that transcends not just boundaries between peoples, but the boundaries between past and future, between who we were and who we choose to become. Love, they discovered, was not about possession or sacrifice. It was about transformation, the miraculous alchemy that happens when two souls choose to grow together instead of apart, when they decide that the world is big enough for both their dreams and brave enough to build something that neither could have imagined alone. In the end, Thomas Harrington had been right about one thing in that dusty canyon: love does make you bigger. It makes you bigger than your mistakes, bigger than your fears, and bigger than the small, safe life you thought you had to settle for. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, it makes you brave enough to stand in the middle of a narrow canyon pass, with everything you've ever wanted at risk, and choose trust over safety, hope over certainty, and tomorrow over today. Love, after all, transcends every boundary we think we know, including the boundary between the story we think we're living and the one we're actually brave enough to write.